So I want to talk about something that I talked about last week that I was not able. Obviously, the episode wasn't salvaged, so hopefully we can talk about that now. Um, so I want to talk about the minimum wage and why a bad law or a bad fix is worse than no law or no fix. So hopefully people can hear me now. So obviously the minimum wage has been in the news a lot. There's been some discussion that the minimum wage could be raised to $15 an hour pegged to inflation by 2026. Obviously there's issues there because in 2026, $15 will not be worth what $15 then will not be worth what $15 is today. Additionally, uh, additionally, the problem becomes once it is fixed as a problem or brought up to whatever wage people think is appropriate, we're going to have the problem of it becomes very difficult to deal with that issue again. Let me just get a sip here and then I'll talk a little more about that. So what happens, the reason the minimum wage is important to this conversation is because when we talk about fixing things uh, that hopefully shouldn't have to be fixed in the future, the minimum wage is a really good example because the minimum wage effectively gets lower every year, right? Because of the way that prices go up every year. I'm sure you've heard of the Consumer Price Index. If not, it's often shortened to CPI. CPI is essentially just a measure of the increase in prices of consumer goods and services every year. So you can actually see, I think it goes up a few percent every year, but you can see essentially in real time, well, not in real time, but once a year, you can pretty much get a report from the federal government as how much weaker your dollar is against the types of things you have to buy. So it doesn't have specific items on there, but it might list like a set of services or a utility or something like that, where it gets the amount of money that it takes to acquire that service or that good increases because the price goes up, which means that your wage goes down every year because the real value of that wage, it buys fewer things, right? So if we're going to fix the minimum wage, we have to pay it to inflation to make sure that every year workers get a raise, to make sure that the value of that wage, whatever it is, continues to be worth that amount the next year, right? Or else we just have this problem where the minimum wage kind of constantly needs to be fixed, and there always needs to be political will to do it. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second too. So I'm going to use the minimum wage as an example just because it's in the news, but generally speaking, the conversation I want to have a little bit is about bad laws and bad fixes. So you may have heard of political capital. Political capital is essentially the amount of leeway that you have with the public to do the things that you want to do, the amount of support you have from the public, and the amount of pressure that other lawmakers feel to cooperate with you when you're first elected or when you're trying to do anything, right? So a great example of this was AOC. When AOC was elected, she had a great amount of political capital. She had lots of support, lots of eyeballs on her, and people were very willing to contact their congresspeople to make noise about the types of things that she was interested in passing. She had political capital, and although she was not able to pass anything particularly with it that was on her priority list, she did get, for example, the resolution about the Green New Deal passed to get that conversation going, and now the Green New Deal is a part of American discourse. So she didn't use that political capital to pass a bill, but she did do it to kind of move the Overton window. Quick aside here, the Overton window is the acceptable range of dialogue in American politics. She was able to move the Overton window a little bit more towards that progressive direction. Another good way to think about political capital is presidents. Typically, when presidents come in, they have a lot of political capital. The other place where political capital is very high, other than elections and re-elections, is if a president is assassinated or something tragic happens to the president's family. Typically, the country will come together around the president Also, if there's a war, right? If there's an attack or if there's some traumatic event that the nation has experienced together, the president typically has a lot of political capital to respond to it, and there's going to be lots of cooperation from other politicians because there's a feeling that whatever it is urgent and has to be solved now, and that we should follow the president either for patriotic reasons or because the president's popular, and tagging your vote to the president's vote is going to help you as well. So that's generally what political capital is. So now that I've explained a little bit what political capital is, I want to talk about political capital in pushed in the direction of fixing things, right? So to go back to the discussion before, politicians have very limited political capital at any given time. Obviously, they get huge surges of political capital at certain points, which I just mentioned. But for the most part, they don't have a ton of political capital. Americans are very distracted. There are lots of issues that people are concerned about. People are issue-oriented in different ways, and things like that. So it is important that a politician uses their political capital to achieve an end that is not going to require a fix, because if they do, when the time comes to fix it, the likelihood is the political capital will not be there to fix the problem. Which brings us back to the minimum wage. And plenty of other issues too, but I do just want to focus on the minimum wage particularly for this. So the minimum wage, if it isn't placed, let me step back for a second. So what needs to happen with the minimum wage, obviously, is that it needs to become a living wage. Whatever that number we decide it is, whether it's 15 or 25 or 30 or whatever, personally, I think it's probably up on the higher end, near 25, especially now. But whatever that number is, it has to be a living wage. And just to remind you, a living wage is a wage that is made by an individual that allows them to afford their basic necessities. And this includes a place to stay, so a month's rent, your utilities, weekly groceries, and anything else that might be essential for your existence as a worker. By the way, this might mean, if you're in the suburbs, having a car, or if there's lots of public transportation by you, bus or train tickets, right? So these 4 or 5 things are the essentials. They're the very basics. With nothing else considered, your wage, if you work 40 hours a week, should cover all of that, right? So if you do the math on that, you run some averages. In 2012, that's what they did, and they figured out that $15 an hour would have been a great minimum wage for 2012. That's when the fight for 15 started. We're now in 2021, it's been 9 years, and each year the value of $15 has decreased. As I mentioned earlier, money inflates each year, so money deflates each year as the prices of goods and services increase each year. However small that might be, it is constant. And if you look at it over the last decade, which is more or less what's passed since the fight for 15 started, you get to a place where you realize that $15 today is not worth nearly as much as $15 in 2012 is worth a different amount than $15 is now. So the point is, with the minimum wage, is that when it finally becomes implemented, it needs to still be a living wage, which is the point I'm trying to get to. So if we're going to have a plan that takes us to 2026, a 5-year plan to implement the minimum wage, whatever the number we pick today is, or when the bill is passed is, needs to be enough or pegged to dollars from today, has to be enough so that it's still a living wage when we get out the other end, right? So if we say it's $25, just for example, and it'll be implemented in 2026, we need to make sure that in 2026, when the $25 minimum wage law is implemented, that $25 an hour still allows people to have a living wage. It's still a living wage for people who are going to be making it at that point, especially because many corporations use the minimum wage as also a maximum wage, and they say, well, we're legally required to pay you this, and we're not going to pay you any more than that. So hopefully this is, hopefully our politicians are thinking about this. They're probably not, but I want you to think about this when you're thinking about the minimum wage conversation going forward. Which brings us back to the original point of this segment, which is why a bad law is worse than no law at all. So for the minimum wage, which is an issue which constantly requires political capital, hopefully I've established that for you. If a bad minimum wage is passed now and it goes through, let's say $12 an hour implemented in 2026, which by the way would be dismal and might actually be worth less than the $7.25 an hour is now. But that aside, so say that it's implemented. So 2026 comes around, it's worth 12. We get $12 an hour. People are making $12 an hour. If $12 an hour in 2026 is a poverty wage, it is going to be almost impossible to raise it. And the reason is because if they do a fix now, the fix is going to be tied to inflation. And the argument from politicians will be, and it will be very easy for them to make this, well, why do we have to fix this issue again? We just fixed it 5 years ago, and it's pegged to inflation, so you get a raise every year. But if the raise you're getting every year is still a poverty wage, then it doesn't matter that you're getting a raise every year. That raise is not providing you with enough money to afford your basics. It is effectively not a living wage. So if there is no solution to the minimum wage fight, people do still suffer. That's true, and I'm not discounting that. But if we pass a minimum wage law now that is pegged to inflation, that doesn't consider what a living wage is or isn't actually a living wage, the problem that we're really going to have is that people will have poverty wages, albeit a tiny bit higher, forever. Because unless there is a real issue, the political will and the political capital will not be there to fix it again. And of course, with the added problem that politicians will say, well, it's pegged to inflation, so you get a raise anyway, every year. This, of course, is not the only issue where this is the case. We can look at things like healthcare, right? So in 2008, the Patient Prevention and Affordable Care Act was passed, also known as the ACA, also known as Obamacare. And it wasn't particularly a great system. Yes, it introduced some fixes to the system, which I have both taken advantage of, like being on my parents' healthcare plan until I was 26, and also being able to get free checkups, what are they called, physicals, so I don't have to pay any copays for that. But the thing is, it wasn't Medicare for all, right? It wasn't a nationalized health care service where no matter what, you could get health care for free, and there wasn't all this bureaucracy involved, and there was only one, and there was a single payer and things like that. So because that is the case, there is going to be less political will now to pass a new healthcare law, because the idea is, well, we passed the Affordable Care Act and it did improve some. Whether you think it's enough or not, and again, just to reiterate, I don't believe it was enough. But the idea, the response from politicians will be, well, it did make some fixes and it was very hard to pass. It shouldn't have been, but it was. So therefore, we should not have, it's going to be very difficult for us to pass a new thing. Therefore, there's not going to be a solution. So regardless of what your issue is, whether it's a Green New Deal that isn't sufficient, an infrastructure plan that isn't sufficient, any of those other things, it's important to remember that it might be better for the society as a whole to actually not have the fix right now until we can get the best fix. Now, there are some things we're running out of time, right? So Green New Deal, obviously anything related to climate change where there's actually a clock going, then it might make sense to accept a bad deal. But for the most part, we need to remember that a bad fix is going to be worse than no fix at all. And hopefully the reasons I just outlined help you understand why that is.